All right. Hello, and welcome to this webinar on architectural considerations when repurposing commercial real estate. I am Lindsey, a senior project architect at Kraemer Design Group for the past 5 years, and prior to that, I worked in New York and in Chicago. KDG is an office of 20 people, including architects, interior designers, historic preservationists, and a graphic designer. Much of our work is in adaptive reuse and historic preservation. Projects range across hospitality, multifamily, office, retail, food and beverage, multiple use groups, and master planning. And we also have projects that are new construction and are of modular construction. Our services include architecture, interiors, and historic consulting. KDG provides landlord services, tenant improvement work, code consulting, and FF&E procurement. And KDG is dedicated to the resurgence of Detroit and has worked on more adaptive reuse projects in downtown Detroit than any other firm. We've honed our skills here and are bringing this expertise to other communities in America's legacy cities. And the objectives for this webinar are to understand broad reasons for adaptive reuse rather than tear down and replacement. We will review key challenges in redeveloping obsolete buildings and see solutions to each of those challenges. I'll show the remarkable transformation of several buildings through case studies. The case studies are all KDG projects. On other slides I'm including, there will be some non-KDG projects as well, just for illustration purposes, but the case studies are KDG projects. And lastly, we'll brainstorm some ideas for the conversion of obsolete buildings and rejuvenation of districts. So why adaptive reuse? Why save building? Why save a building which is by many measures an environmental disaster and an economic nightmare and an obsolete building and a liability? KDG have toured many buildings that were in the worst condition you can imagine, and yet we continue to see opportunity. This enthusiastic approach is based on repeated successes in adaptive reuse. Adaptive reuse and historic projects tap into community history and local pride of place. Even buildings that do not have a lot of architectural significance can have historic value as places that hosted culturally significant events or are personally memorable to people who grew up or worked in the neighborhood. It's good to find out about the history of the building's owners and tenants. People often know interesting stories about a place that are not recorded anywhere. Reuse brings obsolete buildings back into service while helping keep those memories intact. Many of the buildings will have multiple associations. Buildings in downtown Detroit were office buildings or hotels and then functioned as artists' lofts or musicians' lofts. And even with a change in use, the building can exist in plurality, providing the reference for the memories from the past, but also provide a stage for new experiences and, of course, new business. Additionally, with adaptive reuse, it is possible to change the narrative and the trajectory of a neighborhood. Buildings that contribute negatively to a community image can transform and become a new beacon for the future. And this transformation is critical to community morale. With adaptive reuse and preservation, there may be opportunities for unique image and branding. Adaptive reuse offers ready-made branding options, in many cases based on the remaining features or signage on the site. Again, prior owners and tenants may have stories about the building that help form a part of a narrative that informs the branding and design concepts. There are countless examples of buildings that lean on their prior use or identity as a part of their brand after reuse. Former gas station becomes a restaurant with branded references back to its original use, for example. A former distillery becomes a mixed-use development that draws heavily on its industrial history. The photo on the left shows the distillery district in Toronto. In the middle is a similar district that made the news for Windsor, Canada. And the image on the right is a former newspaper headquarters in Detroit, which nods to its history with the name Press 321. 321 being the address on West Lafayette Street. So, walk the building if possible with branding opportunities in mind. Sometimes there are unexpected features or contents that could be repurposed or inspire concepts and branding for the project. There might be, multiple piles of wood crates or something that could be repurposed. I don't know, but there's certainly lots of opportunities. And reuse is inherently sustainable. Demolition and removal, new concrete and steel structures, and new building envelope materials, and the transportation associated with all those are all energy intensive activities. Repurposing an existing building retains the embodied energy of the original structures while eliminating a large amount of the energy used in production and transportation. On the left in the top right is the Detroit Free Press building. It's a massive structure built with a factory for the printing presses in the basement. It had newspaper offices above and it had rentable offices in the tower. Had this been torn down and a new building built in its place, the energy to demolish the massive structure and the stone and brick facades, plus the energy to produce, ship, and erect a new structure, is vastly more than the energy and materials needed to replace all of the MEP systems and the interior finishes. This was also a historic preservation project, so there were a number of features inside that were retained. And there are people in Detroit who remember working in this building and have reported some of the stories back to KDG and to the developer Bedrock. So while excited about the redevelopment of the Hudson site, also shown here, many of us would have loved to see what adaptive reuse of the department store could have resulted in, especially considering how many people had a personal connection to and memories of the Hudson store. Adaptive reuse creates value rather than employing a standard formula. So when a standard formula for development works, it gets repeated. Consequently, many communities have an interchangeable appearance. On the lower left is a sampling of a typical 4/1 and 3/1 developments featured in Bloomberg Business Week. These are all across the US. But when applying that formula to an obsolete building, such as stating a rule of thumb that a floor plate over 60 feet deep will not be suitable for residential building, then these opportunities are lost. Two unconventional floor plates shown on the right were challenges that were overcome. Again, so I just sort of trying to suggest that, um, rather than getting this cookie cutter architecture, we're really taking something and creating value from something that seemingly has no value. Um, so adaptive reuse creates new value from obsolete structure by capitalizing on these opportunities, and the results contribute notably to placemaking. And in the lower center, a former church that doesn't easily convert into apartments. Um, but this Bushwick apartment by others has an asking rent of $3,925 a month. So again, creating value from seeming obsolescence. There are numerous incentives for adaptive reuse. Buildings over 50 years old often have eligibility for historic tax credits. A building does not have to be in an already established historic district. It can be individually nominated, and it can even be part of a non-contiguous historic district. Buildings with environmental problems are eligible for brownfields tax credits. A building can utilize programs such as the Obsolete Property Rehabilitation, which is known as OPRA, and the Revitalization and Placemaking Program, RAP, to name a few. In Michigan alone, from 2016 to 2020, $983 million in rehabilitation expenditures on historic projects qualified as QREs for federal historic tax credits. While looking for opportunities with the building's history and narrative, also review some of the key challenges that will influence the adaptive reuse of the project. Here are several notable characteristics that can be challenges and can be opportunities. Though a new residential development generally limits the floor plate to 20 or 30 feet for an apartment, deep spaces and windowless spaces in obsolete buildings can lead to surprising amenities. On several KDG projects, the belly of deep floor plates becomes the community rooms, fitness centers, game rooms, work share spaces, and similar amenities. You can see here in the darker gray in the middle here, these are some of the amenities for this particular project. Additionally, windowless bedrooms are allowed in the state of Michigan where mechanical ventilation is provided. These bedrooms are often valued for isolation from street noise and nighttime light pollution. It is possible to have an apartment that is 75 feet deep and 16 feet wide in an adaptive reuse project. You can see just how massive these buildings are that are getting turned into apartments. Many commercial buildings have floor level changes, especially older buildings, that need to be negotiated in adaptive reuse projects, especially when they're linked buildings. These are challenging, especially for accessibility, but can be overcome with ramps and strategic placement of the new elevators. Floor changes often create interesting interior pathways. Interconnecting the buildings has the advantage of reducing the total floor area devoted to exit stairs. Each separate building typically requires 2 exits from each floor. When the buildings are internally linked, the buildings can share the exits, free up additional leasable space. Key considerations include circulation and egress. Reuse of the building may require rethinking the overall circulation and egress strategies. Change of use often changes the elevator traffic loads, which can affect the total count of necessary elevators. The hand-drawn sketch on the left shows the Genesee County Bank building in Flint, where historically the main entrance was off the main street on the right, and the elevators were just inside the building, marked here in blue. As a hotel, however, the building entrance and elevators needed to be at the left end, adjacent to the driveway and drop-off area, and closer to the parking garage located across the street. As a hotel, instead of offices, the building can function with 2 elevators instead of 3. Adaptive reuse often results in a different number of elevators based on new use and traffic. An additional consideration for projects is where existing stairs were not continuous from the upper floors to the street exits, and fire-rated transfer corridors had to be constructed. A double cut section on the right shows the Detroit Free Press building, where the existing stairs were not contiguous from the top of the building all the way down to the street. We had to have a new fire resistance rated transfer corridor constructed here. Additionally, there was a fire escape for a couple of floors on this building that was removed and replaced by this new infill transfer. You can keep fire escapes on existing buildings in some situations, but the trade-offs with fire safety are pretty substantial. So sometimes, especially like in a hotel project, like the one on the left here, the developer is going to opt to replace that fire escape with a new exit stair, which was done here. Archaic assemblies are walls or floors that are constructed with materials that are not commonly used anymore, such as terracotta and gypsum block. These assemblies do not meet current codes or are difficult to evaluate because the assembly is not an assembly that has been fire resistance tested in a lab and listed. When evaluating a building for adaptive reuse, the existing finishes can be luxurious and historically important, but the substrate should be probed to determine if it is an inferior assembly. The rehabilitation code for existing buildings allows for trade-offs where new life safety systems like sprinklers and fire alarms can offset the risk of substandard wall and floor assemblies, or fire escapes for that matter. But analysis of existing assemblies is often required by the authorities having jurisdiction, and sometimes upgrade of the total assembly is necessary. Also note that on hospitality projects where a major hotel brand is involved, the hotel brand may require a higher level of protection, even if the building code allows you to use those trade-offs. And this photo here in the middle, this existing stair here did not have a 2-hour fire-rated enclosure, and it was actually very difficult to achieve that. So the hotel and the local authorities did accept an upgrade of this stair enclosure without meeting that full 2-hour requirement that would be in place for a new high-rise building. The buildings may have archaic structural systems as well. The floors could be flat arch tile rather than concrete slab, or it could be concrete on tin pans, both of which complicate construction of new shafts. It's best to know this when starting an adaptive reuse project so you can plan for it. If you can get original drawings of the older buildings early on in the process, that can be a significant help in planning adaptive reuse of that building, especially with structural drawings. If you have a 100-year-old building and you don't have structural drawings, the need for probing and testing can be more substantial. Many older buildings have windows located right on the property line, sometimes facing an empty lot, and sometimes right above the roof of the neighboring building. This is a significant hazard, but the window openings can be kept with the use of fire-rated steel windows or water curtain sprinkler heads. So they essentially get grandfathered in with increased protection. Quite a few of our projects have had lot line windows located in the kitchens or corridors or in the second side of sleeping rooms in our apartment buildings. These run the risk of getting covered over if an adjacent building is constructed, but until then, these spaces can benefit from the additional daylight. And also from a historic point of view, if you can retain those windows, that does keep the original look of the building, which is definitely a plus. One is often surprised that some of the most deteriorated buildings can be restored. Many of our projects had pervasive water infiltration. This has led to collapsed floors, extensive plaster damage, as well as mold and plant growth. Vacant or under-supervised buildings may have had intruders, resulting in graffiti and damage and loss from scrappers. It is important to determine if the project will, quote unquote, just be adaptive reuse or if it'll utilize historic tax credits. Historic materials can be restored in many cases. Cornices and exterior details originally made of terracotta or stone can be repaired or, if needed, recreated out of glass fiber reinforced plastic or glass fiber reinforced concrete, GFRP and GFRC respectively. Based on the existing architectural features, you can basically recreate the detail, or if you don't have those features anymore, you can recreate them from drawings, which we've done on several projects. Ornamental plaster inside the building can be recast from the existing, or again, by using original drawings or from photographs. So we're going to move into the case studies. This is Fort Industry Square in Toledo. It's a full block of 19th century buildings that have been renovated and unified. Despite the challenges of transitioning between floor levels to interconnect the buildings, the project successfully linked 10 buildings with 85 apartments across the upper floors. We've got offices on the second floor, and we've got future retail space at grade level on Summit Street. The lots slope steeply down toward the rear of the building, which you can see here. And the east half of the city block has parking lots, so service access and parking access are at the basement level on the back. As a historic tax credit project, the team focused on the cast iron facades and the historic replica windows, as well as repairing and cleaning the original brick facades and painting. Most of the historic elements are at the exterior of the building. The interiors had been significantly altered over time. The ornate cornices were restored as well, and the owner took advantage of this opportunity to add architectural lighting to the facade, which highlights the cornice. If you get a chance to go down here in the evening, the building looks really wonderful. We had a similar project prior to that in Milan. So we completed a similar project on East Main Street. Again, to optimize the rentable floor area, the buildings were linked on the upper floors and the apartments shared the 2 exits per floor, basically 1 on each end. The streetscape was renovated by removing modern cladding from the corner building and the second building here. And all the masonry was repaired and clean, and the storefronts were reconstructed with more of a consistent look to them. This is actually a really wonderful block in downtown Milan. So in Toledo is the Burdan. In the warehouse district that is adjacent to downtown Toledo, the Burdan is an excellent example of a successful adaptive reuse of an obsolete warehouse into comfortable loft-like apartments. This massive building was a deteriorated warehouse with deep floor plates. Water damage had been pervasive, and several sections of the floor had collapsed, which you can see here. That's not a reflecting pool, that's a large hole in the floor. This was a historic tax credit project. The warehouse has a simple overall architectural style without ornamental details, but the timber structure with its steel brackets, connections, and the wood stair and the brickwork were all repaired, cleaned, and highlighted. Windowless interior bedrooms make use of the deep floor plate and the wide common corridor allows the timber columns to be separate from the walls. This impressive timber structure was expressed wherever possible on the project. The property slopes such that the basement is at ground level on one end and contains commercial space that is diagonally across from the home plate entrance to the Fifth Third Field, which is the home of the Toledo Mud Hens. The Standard Lofts in Toledo is a block away from the Berdan, and it is a similar but smaller warehouse conversion completed several years before the Berdan. Like the Berdan, the facades had deteriorated and darkened considerably, and water infiltration was pervasive, and the floors had holes in them as well. The triangular floor plan of the building, which is the result of a former railroad spur across the site, presented a challenge in laying out the apartments. But rather than fight the geometry, the design embraces the configuration by creating corridors that alternate between orthogonal and diagonal segments. This resulting from this geometry is a mix of 1 and 2 bedroom apartments with a variety of configurations. The historic wood stair was restored, and this building also looks wonderful now that it has been completed. The new center building, which is now called the Con, is located diagonally across from the Fisher Building and the Fisher Theater in Detroit. It's a 14-story block-long structure, and it was built as the new center office building. The building was designed by Detroit architect Albert Kahn and was completed in 1931. The building contains vast retail space at the ground level and was once a Saks Fifth Avenue department store from 1940 through 1979. Above that, the large floor plates held offices for decades until the building slowly emptied out. The office of Albert Kahn Incorporated was one of the last tenants in the building before redevelopment. The ground floor remains as commercial space ready for new retail tenants. Like the Berdan, the residential levels have apartments with windowless interior bedrooms, which make use of the deep floor plates. There is so much space at the middle of the building that the corridors loop around generous amenity spaces, including fitness center, a yoga room, game rooms, community room with a wet bar, and a library, as well as offices and meeting rooms. There's also management offices. I think there's even a storage room in part of the belly of the building here. The project utilized historic tax credits and preserved the exteriors, the Art Deco lobby, which is seen here, and the elevator lobbies upstairs. All of the retail and most of the office space had been altered by tenants over the years. So primarily, the historic features are at the facade and especially the windows. The original bronze windows had never been replaced and are a significant defining architectural feature of the building. Repair to the windows was planned rather than replacement, but the developer was also interested in improving the performance of the windows, energy performance. Insulated glazing units achieve a higher thermal resistance, but the spacing between the double panes exceeds the space between the stops on the sashes of these existing windows, so an innovative solution was needed. The Con is a remarkable project for the successful use of vacuum insulated glazing, VIG units. Because the vacuum has a much higher thermal resistance than argon or air between the panes, the space between the panes could be less than standard insulated glass unit and maintain that dimension of the existing windows. Tiny spacers that are nearly invisible to the eye keep the panes from cupping inward or from breaking. This innovative window alteration was reviewed and approved by the National Park Service, and the project was approved for historic tax credits. One of Detroit's most cherished renovations is the David Whitney Building at Grand Circus in downtown Detroit. This project is a very good example of adaptive reuse of obsolete office space with an odd-shaped footprint. As originally constructed, the building had several stories of retail organized around a grand atrium space. with a glass ceiling. The office floors above formed a ring around that courtyard over the atrium. The building had deteriorated over the years and was modernized in the 1960s to try and make it more attractive to new tenants. Historic detailing was stripped off the facade, and much of the interior architectural features remained, albeit with continuing deterioration. It emptied of tenants by the late 1980s and stood vacant for many years. Two important keys to redevelopment of the David Whitney was the use of historic tax credits, along with diversifying the space through mixed use. The redevelopment featured new apartments on the top floors, a hotel in the middle floors, and commercial space around the atrium on the lower floors. The multiple use program leverages the risks of developing large floor areas in an economically challenged market. At the time, several historic high-rise buildings had been vacant in downtown Detroit for years, and some for decades. The Whitney building in downtown Detroit had been modernized in the 1980s. Oh, no, that's actually incorrect. Sorry. What I wanted to say is that it was modernized and much of the historic ornament was removed from the facades. Working from the original drawings of the building, the facade was restored back to the original design and undid that modernization. Where glazed terracotta details and skin had been removed from the building, new glass fiber reinforced plastic units were cast and installed. Restoration of the facade brought the building back to its original design, and it stands as one of Detroit's most cherished landmarks. A skylight over the atrium was replaced, carefully aligning the new skylight frames with the structure below so that the look of the skylight would not change. Existing interior materials were repaired and restored wherever possible in the common areas. One architectural feature to look for in adaptive reuse projects, especially historic adaptive reuse projects, are the doors in the common corridors. The configuration of the corridors needs to be retained to the greatest extent possible, and the spacing and rhythm of the door openings needs to be retained on a historic tax credit project. Doors to new apartments or new hotel rooms had to use existing door locations as much as possible. Doors that were not needed could be sealed off on the built-out side, on the apartment side of the guest room side, as long as the corridor retained that historic look. Furthermore, the transom windows over the doors can have walls built behind them to achieve the fire resistance rating that's required, but those transoms should remain in the corridor to maintain that historic look. Historic considerations are the period of significance, the historic materials, the proportions and configuration of important spaces, character and rhythm of the openings. Where it is a historic tax credit project, many of these aspects can limit the reconfiguration of the spaces for adaptive reuse, but it may be well worth it, as is the case here with the Whitney building. The Detroit Free Press building. 321 West Lafayette was built in 1922 for the headquarters of the Detroit Free Press newspaper. The Free Press had been located in a smaller office building a few blocks east, and they hired the architect Albert Kahn to design a building that was both a factory and an office building. The building occupies an entire half block in the western part of downtown Detroit. Massive newspaper presses were located in the basement. The newspaper's production floors and staff offices were on the large second and third floor levels for the most part. Above that, two courtyards divide the fourth through sixth floors into an E-shaped plan. So here are the courtyards. An E-shaped plan at the middle floor levels. But then at the top part, there is a tower that extends upward of just the middle portion of the building, and a lot of those spaces were leased out as to office tenants. The ground floor commercial spaces have been, excuse me. Multiple use groups address the challenges with the varied floor plate sizes and shapes. Apartments laid out well on the upper tower and the E-shaped floors at the middle levels. But the half-block sized lower levels are better suited as office space. And then the ground floor commercial spaces have been prepped for retail use, and the giant printing room in the basement is now occupied by a robotic car parking and retrieval system. This project also utilizes historic tax credits. The facades were restored, the windows were replaced with historic replica windows, and the corridors and main lobby retained the original design. This is the main lobby. As noted in one of the challenges slides earlier in this presentation, the building did not have two sets of exit stairs that were continuous to the street level. So transfer corridor was built on the roof of the lower portion of the building at the 7th floor level. This is under construction, and this is the Holden Street project. Dream Detroit is creating value out of seemingly nothing. The group set up a recycling center and artist event space in a former factory space located in a relatively vacant part of Detroit. The factory does have significance, historic significance. It was the Lincoln Motor Car plant. The project is utilizing historic tax credits. Redevelopment will convert the former factory space into apartments and artist studio spaces. Several of the studio spaces will have frontage that allows for gallery and pop-up retail use. A commercial space facing the intersection of Holden and Lincoln Streets could become a cafe or a restaurant or retail space. Financing for this project has been a challenge for Dream Detroit, but risks are inherent in creative endeavors like this where real value is being forged from a former wasteland. This adaptive reuse project is located a little bit outside of the new center neighborhood and is poised to have a significant impact on the new Goldberg and other adjacent neighborhoods. Here's a project that is currently on the boards called Detroiters First. This is another initiative that has been difficult to get financing for, but could create new value from obsolete properties. The developer is looking to convert an underutilized or obsolete warehouse space into a co-working community for small light industrial companies and the maker demographic. We've studied a few different Detroit buildings to see how the space can be divided up and supported by a utilities trunk that goes down the center of the main space to create sort of a plug and play approach to workshop spaces. As we saw in the Holden Street project, industrial buildings in Detroit, while not ornate like office buildings downtown, they do have historic significance and could be approved for historic tax credits to support the adaptive reuse work. Several low-rise and mid-rise industrial buildings in Detroit have been demolished in recent years, reducing opportunities such as this for historic preservation and adaptive reuse of Detroit's important industrial heritage. Opportunities and conceptualization. Often it can be difficult to overcome a prevailing view on obsolete buildings. In the 1960s and 1970s, mill buildings in New England and in much of the US had lost their industrial businesses, and the buildings were seen as derelict, obsolete eyesores, which were too massive to find new owners and tenants. They sat vacant and deteriorated. Preservationists documented the buildings and fought for their protection. And over time, inventive reuse work converted mill buildings into offices, shopping malls, artists' lofts, and multifamily apartment buildings. Loft buildings became fashionable and had a cachet that extends deep into marketing of properties now. Even buildings that barely qualify as lofts might have a loft look. Perhaps the equivalent now to the lofts and mill buildings half a century ago are the retail dinosaurs that characterize many of our communities now. We've got obsolete strip malls and department stores and full-on malls that are vacant or underutilized. With some imagination and some risk-taking, these too could earn cachet. If possible, hire an architectural study for a project concept. It may be worthwhile to review the current zoning early on, an architect to help generate ideas for an obsolete commercial building before you have a buyer, which may give some direction on the type of owner or tenant that could use the building, potential clients to market to. The concept could tap into the local history or the history of the neighborhood or the narrative of the building itself and the people who used it. What is the potential vibe? The building could be envisioned in a broader district context. What will be the anchors of that district and what would be the potential barnacles of that? What is the is this adaptive reuse project a potential catalyst for that neighborhood? And what use could create more value by spurring more development? And in these buildings, are there historic details that could be capitalized upon? Would this existing plaster detail inspire some of the new detailing that's done in the interior design of the project? Again, sometimes these early vibes can help inform the potential future use of the building. Also, what analogous projects are out there that could shed some light on potential for this property? You can tap into professionals' background knowledge. Like many in the development industry, architects are likely to know about comparable projects. They also may be working on projects that they can't discuss due to confidentiality clauses, but that could still inform their initial take on a potential reuse of a commercial building. Also, what is missing from the community that the adaptive reuse could address? Perhaps through community engagement or studies, the property could be considered from a more organic demand side view than from our sort of standard formulaic supply side view. What are some of the long-term or less obvious benefits to a particular type of adaptive reuse? Would the community benefit from more senior housing, fresh food markets, and medical malls, or from art spaces, bars, and venues? So what to consider for adaptive reuse? Just about anything. There is a wide variety of surprising reuse projects. Through some risk taking and a little brainstorming, value can be created from obsolete properties. Perhaps we start with the housing shortage. Obsolete commercial properties may need to be converted into housing to come back into service. This includes the aforementioned mill buildings and light industrial buildings. Schools have been converted into multifamily residential buildings, one in Iowa, shown here in the lower left corner. Has been a lot of press about studies and proposals for converting obsolete shopping centers into multi-use developments by adding residential stories above the commercial space and landscaping the vast parking lots. There's also been conversion where, for example, here in the center, one of the oldest shopping malls in the US in Rhode Island has been converted into apartments. This image is from Pinterest. There is current initiative to successfully convert obsolete shopping centers or strip malls into senior housing communities, and this might be a home run. Um, Retail strips that are basically all wheelchair accessible. They're centrally located in a community near major thoroughfares, have ample parking. The deep floor plates may be a challenge and the lack of rear yards, but as shown in some of our other case studies, there are solutions that can be effective. Other community needs. There may be community needs that can be met by converting obsolete commercial space into other types besides housing. There has been press about retail strips being converted into medical malls. Churches are often converted into venues or restaurants and even apartments. Another example is a brownstone synagogue in Hoboken, New Jersey that was converted into apartments. Monumental historic government buildings can be challenging for adaptive reuse, but can be converted into event spaces with assembly and food and beverage uses. A number of adaptive reuse projects include the Green Garage in Detroit. It's a co-working space at a former automobile showroom. There's Red Crown in Grosse Pointe Park, which was formerly a gas station converted into a restaurant. There is Jam Handy, which was a historic television studio in Detroit, which has been converted into a concert venue, event space. A former church in Epping, New Hampshire was converted into a restaurant. Central train stations have been converted into museums, multiple use convention centers with food and beverage tenants, retail markets, and hotel space. I think this is true in Philadelphia, St. Louis. I feel like there's a number of other cities too where these really large buildings have been turned into multiple use centers. Even here, this old water tower, not the kind that we have in the US with the stem, but a full footprint water tower was converted into apartments in Europe. There are former factory grounds in Europe where the massive mechanical and plumbing structures became features in a new landscape park and gardens. So that in and of itself doesn't provide a lot of income, but it is a destination and has rejuvenated the area around it. So where conversions are intended, am I trying to say? I'm trying to say that other conversions which are as intended as neighborhood catalysts would include where standard development options won't work and more unusual reuse concepts need to be applied. So perhaps the obsolete district needs to follow the model of artists occupying an undervalued properties and then building up cachet for that area over time. That will eventually attract the higher profit redevelopment projects. And I'm going to offer an analogy here. The tallest building in the world, the Burj Khalifa in Dubai, does not have a good return on its investment for itself. But in the broader context of the developer's other properties and the district and the city on the whole, the Burj Khalifa is a catalyst for profitable properties around it. So I'm saying we can apply that same approach to some properties in obsolete districts. So while there are many opportunities for adaptive reuse that work from existing architecture and history to develop new places that create value back to the property and catalyze resurgence of the community. And that's it. So I want to thank you very much. We can't do questions and answers because this is not a live session, but I hope that this has given you some ideas on what to look for when looking at these obsolete properties to be able to approach these properties with a lot of enthusiasm and hope for some creative solutions that can bring these buildings back into service and help them also retain some of the history and memories of our communities. So again, thank you very much. My name is Nate Lindsey with Kraemer Design Group, and it was a pleasure to present to you. Thank you.